We're live, everybody. It is another Sunday morning, and Jason was on assignment. We got Dr. Jene Bramel, and there he is with the entrance. Beautiful entrance. Mitch Carl, DFS and Donuts. Again, folks, if you don't know about Rise or Fall, and you're not following Mitch, you are missing out. Gene, let's start with Julio Jones. Is he going to miss out on NFL Week 5?
Yeah, I think it's likely. And he's been telling us for weeks that he's not comfortable with his health, didn't practice at all, really wasn't even cleared to run and even test the strength of his hamstring until Friday. Dan Quinn didn't want to rule him out. They listed him questionable as they often do. Julio tries to play through these injuries frequently, but missed one game in week 3 and 2 other games he's been significantly limited in. It's hard to see a player that's not comfortable and confident in his status, not able to do much through the week, be able to come back and get full usage and productive snaps this week. So I'm expecting him to be inactive. If he's on the active roster and plays, I think it's going to be limited at best.
Okay, what do we do here, Mitch? And an interesting slate in so much as it's a little bit of a thinner slate. So getting the lineup uniqueness might be a little more difficult. So we just go back to the center of who do we like. Olamide Zaccheaus, I'm not sure what his cost is, but I know that he's trending up. He seems like the play, or is this a situation where you let the herd follow that? Thumbs up or thumbs down on him this week?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought him up. And I'm also happy, Sig, that you used his name for me, because I was about to call him Olamide Zaccheaus. Legitimately, I've never heard it said before.
Let's call him Oz.
Oz. All right. I like that name. I did see a little bit of him play last week, and the kid actually looks pretty decent. He does. He's had a snap rate of 79% in week 3, 76% in week 4, and we saw him have 9 targets last game as well. Caught 8 of them for 80 or so odd yards. Yeah. 3K on DraftKings is really hard to ignore from a player who clearly is going to garner some attention from Matt Ryan in a very nice looking game stacking environment there between Carolina and Atlanta. And on top of that, you have a guy that you can run back on a team implied total of 28 points with your Teddy Bridgewater stacks. You could go Teddy Bridgewater to Robbie Anderson running back with Oz. You can full game stack with Teddy, Mike Davis, one of the wide receivers, and then have Oz and Ridley back on the other side. I mean, there is potential here where this game hits the over. The total has dropped a point since it opened, but I still think this game's potentially going to be one of those sneaky over games, right? Where the public's starting to say that total opened a little too high. They're starting to focus elsewhere. And you already mentioned, if the slate is shrinking and people are now starting to get off of the highest total on the slate, that makes me want to get back on it.
Yeah, and Zaccheaus just gobbles up catches, and that's what he did in Virginia. Any thoughts on Robbie Anderson versus DJ Moore, Mitch, if you have to pick one?
Yeah, I truly am all over Robbie Anderson this week. I think that he just clearly shows a little bit more upside and consistency. If we had a situation here where DJ Moore had just upside for days, and it looked so much better than the upside of Robbie Anderson, even though Robbie Anderson was more consistent, well, then I probably go with DJ Moore. But right now, currently in, I guess, the construct of how Carolina runs their offense, Robbie Anderson is the consistent player. He's the upside player. He's the downfield threat. He's now becoming somewhat of a red zone threat. So for me, it's not even close. And the pecking order likely goes Robbie Anderson, Mike Davis. And then if I have any room or salary left over for DJ Moore or even Curtis Samuel for these larger game stacks, that's where I go.
Carolina with a chance to move into first place. Rooting for Teddy. Team Teddy. Gene, Henry Ruggs has had at least one ailment, more than one ailment, and it seemed like things trended down a little bit, trending up going in to week 5. If the Raiders have a chance to hang with the Chiefs today, it sure seems like Ruggs is the path to that. Is he a path to any fantasy success today? What do you think about his condition going into week 5?
I was expecting him to play without much question today. There was a report from Tom Pelissero this morning that the Raiders hadn't formally decided whether or not he'd be able to go, but he fully practiced on Thursday and Friday, seems to be recovered from the hamstring issue that came up as he was recovering from that MCL sprain earlier in the year. So maybe that's a sign that they may bring him back in a little bit more slowly than expected. expected, but I would expect him to be active. Whether or not he gets a full diet of targets and touches remains to be seen. But, given everything that's going on, depending on what you have on your roster, I think, probably somewhere between 5 and 8 targets is a reasonable expectation for him.
Yeah, we saw again in that first game when Ruggs was healthy, the Ruggs ratios, they were really trying to get the ball into his hands. I saw something, Mitch, that the Millie Maker winners have all had like quarterback, wide receiver, and an opposing wide receiver. Is this game? I know we talked about talked about Carolina, Atlanta as a chance for that. Is this one maybe with Ruggs is configuration? What do you think about the Chiefs today after they underachieved in their Week 4 game? What are our DFS thoughts for Raiders Chiefs?
You know what? I appreciate you jumping to this game next because I actually caught myself, misspoke, said that the Carolina and Atlanta game had the highest total on the board. Completely had forgotten about this game. A little Sunday morning gaffe right there. But, 56.5 point total. Yeah, absolutely. There are some game stacking appeal here. I think you could go with Mahomes. Just go for the primary pieces, my friends. I don't think you need to get too cute here. You go with Mahomes, throw in Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, run it back on the other side with Darren Waller. This guy has a 29% market share this year. That is incredible. That's higher than George Kittle, who at 27% is still 4% higher than any other tight end in the league. That's how heavy he is being targeted in this offense. And in Week 1, he still garnered 8 targets on an 89% snap share. It's not like he's going to be taken off the field or not be thrown to if Ruggs returns today. I'm all over Waller in all formats, cash, GPP, MME. If you're doing large game stacks, small stacks, just throw the ball to Waller and throw him in your lineups.
Yeah, last year, by the way, in these games, the Chiefs easily handled the Raiders. They weren't really even competitive games, either game. So we'll see if this version of the Raiders can hang with this version of the Chiefs. Big news, again, the NFL news cycle, just the way time is passing. It seems like forever ago that Bill O'Brien was fired. It was just this week. Gene, we're going to be watching this game to watch the Texans in the post-O'Brien era. Also, we want to watch Laviska Shenault. He's one of the rookies that are most exciting to watch. Edge of your seat when the ball's in his hands. Will he be out there for this one?
Yeah, it looks like he will. They took him off the injured report altogether, the game status report on Friday afternoon, so expect him to play. It was a little bit concerning. He was listed as a hamstring last week. Seemed to get through the game without too much difficulty and then didn't do much in practice on Wednesday. Doug Marrone was sort of wishy-washy about his status. Turns out that that's probably not much of a concern. He should be good to go.
Good to go on this one, Mitch. Okay, let's tease this apart for DFS purposes. Do you go with the crowd? 60-70% of your lineups with James Robinson in this one, or do you fade? It's a high level decision, and I think that's the only way to approach that decision this week. You got the mute button. You're evoking Dr. Gene.
My apologies. It's imitation is the best form of flattery there, Gene.
Exactly.
Yes. So I'm right there with you. That's a very, very sharp take. James Robinson, great spot. Houston's run defense, clearly horrendous. It's appalling how bad they are. And I think that makes a lot of people be on James Robinson. But for me, at James Robinson's price points, give me some Kareem Hunt. That guy has 35-point upside across the industry on any site you're pretty much looking at. And he's at a similar price point. Mike Davis, I like the role he plays a little bit more. And, those are same price points. So it's hard for me to go on James Robinson. Also, I like Gardner Minshew a lot this week. I think there's an opportunity here for him to have quite the game. He's a nice looking pivot away from some of these exposures on volatile players like Daniel Jones. I'll pay a few $100 more and get Gardner Minshew, who has looked pretty good this season. And, this wide receiving core, they are young and they are talented. They're a lot more talented than I think a lot of people understand. Now, going back to Laviska, I hope he gets on the field a little bit more. We saw his snap rate drop down to 54% this past week. He's still running third on the team each week behind Keelan Cole and DJ Shark. He also was third on the team the 1 week that Shark missed, and Chris Conley ended up leading the team in snaps. So unfortunately, he's not getting on the field a ton, and his price is starting to rise. I think if you're doing very large tournaments like the Millie Maker, things like that, Shenault's probably a fine option in some sort of game stack. Outside of that, players like that, it's very difficult to target when they're not already getting a large percent of targets, and they're also not in the field for, a majority of the snaps.
Do we have any angles here? And Mitch, I mean, chances are because you're really good at what you do, and it's DFS, so it's very unemotional and analytical. That this is where I can get swept aside. But the Bill O'Brien, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead narrative angle here. Do we see Deshaun Watson as somebody that maybe we want to try to get into some lineups, or otherwise look at a bounce for the Texans offense coming into this one? By the way, this would be my highest total of the game, highest total of the day game, based on how these teams are playing coming into this one. Just another thing to feed the fire.
Yeah, it's really hard not to like Houston today at that, implied total of 30.5 points right now. And I think it's one of those spots where, they're going to play with fire, right? The coach is gone. Ding dong, the witch is dead. It's time for Watson and the team to kind of rise from the ashes here. I think that we have an opportunity to have a nice game stacks here today. I truly think so. I'm going back to the well with Brandon Cooks, who burned a lot of people last week. He was on the field for 94% of the snaps in week 4. He's still out there. He's out there. And being on the field at that high of a rate, you're going to have an opportunity, especially if Watson drops back 35, 40 times. And if you're doing game stacks, go ahead and throw out Brandon Cooks on the other side. And I think there's an opportunity for, one of those patented Cooks long touchdown receptions, even if it's like 5 for 90 on the day and a score, you'll be very happy with that at that price point. I think the crowd will be on Will Fuller in this situation. You can leverage that by going with Cooks, who just completely shredded so many lineups last week. And I think that, suppresses his ownership a bit. And I really like this game. And I think it's very, very sneaky for large tournaments like the Millie Maker. I think you could see a winner come out of this either on the Watson side or the Minshew side. And because there's just so many great pieces, and they're all going to be slightly lower owned because there are so many great pieces, and nobody's really that like funneled target type player. So it's an interesting spot. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, poor defensive play. It should be interesting to watch this one just to see the reaction of the Texans. Reactions, Gene, this week, seeing Lamar Jackson miss practice for 2 days, did not get a positive reaction. It seemed like Friday, just kind of hand waving, like, hey, no big deal, no problem. Similarly, Mark Andrews spent a lot of time on the injury report last year. Necessarily was tied to his inconsistency. We've already seen that this year. This is a good spot for the Ravens offense against the Bengals, but should we expect these injury report issues may take a little bit off the edge of that offensive performance?
No, I don't think so. I don't have any concern about Baltimore. They routinely use that questionable tag as kind of a proxy for probable. Jackson, I think, would have been back to practice on Thursday. They planned to just give him a day off on Wednesday and then had that little bit of a stomach bug that kept him out for a day or so. And John Harbaugh didn't seem to have any concern. Mark Andrews off and on, but again, we've seen him be effective. Marquis Brown, again, just getting kind of a veteran day off. I don't usually overreact to the questionable tags in Baltimore unless there's a clear injury that we saw the week before, some sort of limitation that we've seen where there's some larger concern. And there wasn't any worry from Adam Schefter about Lamar Jackson. No comments at all about Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews. So all three of those guys should be full strength today.
So we go down to the 7-game early slate, Mitch. And now, as we actually, because the slates are manageable in the 20, 25 minutes I've got you, we're probably going to get through every one of these games because this Ravens offense is the offense you want a piece of. On the other hand, the Bengals, the Ravens defense has been good, but not necessarily a shutdown unit. And you have players like Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon coming off of a huge game, or was it just the opponent, by the way, part of that Houston-Jacksonville game? Who are your top picks, or are there any top picks from this Baltimore-Cincinnati game?
Yeah, I don't really like this game too much. There is one piece I will take from here, though. It's Marquise Brown. I think his price has gone up to a point where people are going to be a little uncomfortable, but there's some metrics I like to look at. Basically, I'm just looking for, are they on the field and are they getting opportunity? And, his snap rate 79% in week 3, 75% in week 4, and he's at a 26.5% market share this year, leads the team by a wide margin. The issue is they're just not chucking the ball that much. So if you think that this game is something where, it's going to be closer, I think you need to stack it. If you think that this is not going to be a competitive ball game, then truly just, either don't touch it or grab the one player you think can benefit the most from the Ravens jumping out to an early lead. For me, that's Marquise Brown.
Yeah, he's just that one hit. We're waiting for that one hit. Maybe Cincinnati is the team that he can get it against, although Geno Atkins back this week. We'll see if the Bengals can get that offense going to keep up with the Ravens. Not the most exciting matchup, Gene. Arizona at the Jets, but Le'Veon Bell should be excited to get back on the field. We're taking Denver, New England. More on this later. Denver, New England players out of lineups. Probably wary about Tennessee, Buffalo. We already had Detroit and Green Bay on bye. So if you're staring down the barrel of putting Bell in your lineup, what are you probably looking at?
I don't know. What do you think of the Jets' offense? I mean, at this point, I think you can't
Don't
be
answer that.
confident about anything, right? And it wasn't as if Bell looked wonderful before he went down with the aggravated hamstring situation. So I think, maybe in PPR leagues, you'd expect him to have a little bit more running back two upside because he's going to be the primary pass catching person out of the backfield. But I don't know that the Jets sustain drives. I don't know if they get enough scoring opportunities to make Bell too attractive to anyone. But, it wasn't to be too much concern when he was put on injured reserve. He had been talking all week that he was ready to come back. I think he's got a point to make. But again, it's a team game. So, despite whatever motivation he may have to be productive today, the opportunities will have to be there for him. And I'll let you guys discuss whether or not you feel like that's likely to happen or not. But I'd have my doubts.
Yeah. Speaking of doubts, maybe you had some doubts, Gene, about DeAndre Hopkins playing last week, but not really looking that impressive. Arizona's offense not impressive, losing at Carolina. They're staying out in the East Coast time zone. So if we're looking at the circadian rhythms theory, that's working against them. But what about Hopkins? Have we seen affirmative evidence that he should be in better shape than he was last week?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't notice too much where he seemed limited. I think that just the entire offense looked out of sync from running game to passing game and beyond. Kyler Murray looked okay moving the ball, running wise, but it just didn't seem like it was the same offense as before. And I don't think that had a ton to do with Hopkins' ankle issue, but you would expect him to be healthier this week for sure, not on the injury report. So good signs for him.
Mitch, with all these attractive games we've already discussed, do we even dip our toe in the water of a Jets-Cardinals game that could be, it was 37-28. Two bad teams played last Thursday night, and there were a lot of points scored. I don't know if the Cardinals are a bad team. They played like a bad team coming into this one. But what do we think about the DFS prospects of this not exactly choice matchup?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I like the way you put that together. Bringing up a highlight of two poor teams that provided solid fantasy opportunity, and I think there's some pieces here today that I'm kind of interested in. One of them is DeAndre Hopkins. I think he's going to be very low owned today in relation to his upside. And health aside, he played 95% of the snaps last week. The guy's healthy. He's healthy enough to be out there almost 100% of the snaps. Jets giving up 32.5 points per game. Jamison Crowder on the other side has over a 30% target market share. I think there's potential to maybe have a little correlation there with Hopkins and Crowder in a lineup without either quarterback. Don't touch Flacco. I don't think you need to go to Murray today. I think you can have that secondary correlation, which is something I talk about often. You have your game stack with a quarterback, Dak to Amari, and you're running it back with Darius Slayton. Inside that lineup, you also have, two wide receivers in the same game where you're getting the hopeful funneled targets to those two players aside from the quarterbacks. You'd think maybe the quarterbacks don't have the greatest game, but all of the targets, opportunity, and points go to two wide receivers. Crowder and Hopkins are two that I actually like this week, having as a secondary stack to your lineup. I also think Kenyon Drake is in a really interesting spot. We are still waiting for that big game, right? He has it. He has it in him. He's more talented than he's shown this year. His snap percentage has not changed each week. It's around 64, 65%. The guy's going to get opportunities sooner or later. If you think that they're going to blow out the Jets, conceivably, he'll have an opportunity to run the ball 20 plus times or so in hammer time, run the clock out type ball game. Chase Edmonds is not that guy. And I think that Kenyon Drake, if he gets in a red zone a couple times, is this the week he blows up? I'm not too sure here. I think they're all GPP plays, and it's a tough spot. It's tough to decide.
Yeah, look, I think that Crowder and his results are pretty difficult to argue with at this point. Hopkins has a matchup against Pierre Desir, which was certainly interesting to watch Desir play. And Drake, what we've seen with the Jets they're still tough up the gut, stopping the run, but they give up big plays. So this could easily be a game where Drake just has to break a long one, and that could make it worth going to him if you are looking for those low ownership angles. I just have you for a couple more minutes, Mitch, so I want to get in real quick before we let you go and serve your wonderful audience. The Giants. So again, there's only 3 games in the afternoon slate, Mitch. the Giants offense, the wells run dry for fantasy, but they haven't got to play the Dallas defense yet. Are we going to get out ahead of this and try to build some Giants-rich lineups, or is that the sucker play this week?
Yeah. Okay. So here's my take. They have faced some pretty tough defenses this year. Okay. Rams, San Francisco, Chicago, Pittsburgh. Those are their first 4 teams they faced this year. Clearly are not firing on all cylinders, have had some injury issues. Running backs. Are there any actual running backs there right now? It's really tough for Daniel Jones. I think this is a spot, though. We are seeing literally anybody get open against this defense. They have the worst secondary, and this pass rush, which was supposed to be the strength of this defense on the Cowboys, is non-existent. And if we finally have an opportunity here where Daniel Jones is not being sacked 3.5 times per game here and pressured over 20% of his dropbacks, if there's an opportunity for Daniel Jones to sit in the pocket a little bit, or even, if they're manned up downfield and he can tuck it and run it and give us another 40, 50, 60 yards on the ground, which gives us 5-6 more points to raise his scoring floor and ceiling. I love this spot. And you asked me last week, do we keep stacking against the Cowboys?
Right.
It's Baker Mayfield. It's this blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes, until proven otherwise, I'm going to continue to stack against the Cowboys. And if this is the week that it burns me, if I get ruined here, my lineups get ruined, my bankroll suffers because I attacked the worst defense I've seen in the last decade. Truly. So be it. Be it. I'll play the probability game, and I'm going to be stacking up like crazy here. I love Evan Ingram. I love Darius Slayton. The Cowboys side, I want literally all of them. I mean, give me all 3 wide receivers. Give me Schultz. Give me Zeke. I'll take Dak. This will be my highest exposure again for like the 3rd or 4th week in a row, and I'll continue to do so. And hopefully, luck is on my side again today. Hopefully.
And until proven wrong, you'll continue to get good advice from Mitch Carl and the team at Rise or Fall, DFSN Donuts. Always love spending time with you, Mitch. And
thank you very much,
making
guys.
time for us on Sundays.
Thank you very much. Good luck today, everybody. Hope somebody wins some serious money and crushes in your fantasy football leagues. Take care.
All right. Serious. Oh, Gene, I'm going to probably have a serious second half of this show. But on the Giants Dallas note, on the serious note, Tyron Smith, neck injuries. Is it possible that this is the last time we've seen him play?
Yeah, I think so. We talk about this all the time, how tough offensive linemen are and the beating that they take and what they tend to play through and us not hear about it. And lots of times that includes some degenerative issue, whether it's bone spurs or disc-related issues or anything else going on with the spine. And after a while, as much as they rely on strength and range of motion and a little bit of weakness that comes from these nerve-related issues, and once you've had a surgery or two, you start to think better of whether or not it's worth playing. So I thought that was the most important note that we saw on Tyron Smith this week, was that there were some reporters that were questioning whether or not he'd retire. And when you start to hear talk like that, it's usually not idle. So hopefully he's able to recover fully and return to what he really enjoys doing, but wouldn't be surprising to see him have to shut it down just because he's not physically capable of playing in the way he played in the past.
All right. Another Sunday morning to awake to news, and we can tease this stuff apart, but let's just get to the actual fantasy football. We work for a fantasy football advice and analysis website. We love serving our fantasy football audience, Gene. So after we're done with this show, I'm going to go through and take all of my Buffalo and Tennessee players out of my lineups, Gene. I mean, I even have one matchup where my choices to pivot from Singletary are like Jordan Wilkins and Wayne Gallman. And already in the back of my head, I'm like, well, who's my Hail Mary here? And hey, silver lining, sometimes the most satisfying moments in fantasy football are when you pick that one player that was the right answer and you get a win because of your acumen. But it's testing a different kind of acumen, Gene. But it is an acumen that we've had to compile in a different way, right? Because we're always gauging. You were one of the very first people, if not the first, to discern that the Packers have a conservative medical staff. So anytime we were weighing Packers decisions on whether players are going to play, we would factor that in. So we have data now on the NFL and how they're going to handle these decisions, and whether we agree with it or it's how we would do it, which is probably the more interesting discussion here, we are factoring it in. So am I overreacting by taking Devin Singletary out for Jordan Wilkins or Wayne Gallman? Or are we saying leave, I mean, I suppose Josh Allen is the toughest call because he offers, and Derrick Henry to an extent too, because of the high ceiling that they offer. But if we just isolate the chances of Buffalo, Tennessee getting played with another positive from Tennessee, with Denver and New England being postponed, what do you think?
Yeah, I have no idea. You said we have some data. We're working with incomplete data. We don't know what the contract tracing suggests. We're not sure exactly what the discussions are. It seems clear that the NFL is working on an accelerated timeline for negative tests with known close contacts and what the contract tracing may be. We don't know what's going on. So it would appear that the Titans' positive overnight was to a staff member who was probably not in the building over the last 14 days. If they have another round of negative testing throughout the team and the players, and the contact tracing suggests that there's very little, if any, chance that this positive occurred within the team facility itself, then you could see this game still being played on Tuesday. But I don't know. I'm trying to discern a little bit of what was different about this week's Denver and New England situation versus last week's New England and Kansas City situation. Was it that it was a Saturday night positive test instead of a Friday night? Was it because there's been a smattering of positive tests throughout the week in New England, and it's unclear whether or not this is the continuing positivity and outbreak from what happened at that dinner last Friday? Is it because the Patriots players spoke up? Is it because the NFL is changing how they are planning to do contact tracing moving forward? It's hard to know. So where are we with the Tennessee? The Tennessee situation has been by far, obviously, the most extensive outbreak so far, and the NFL has continued to be careful about opening the facility. But it's also had been clear that the league really wanted to do whatever it could to keep the season moving in as close to an on-time fashion as possible, and we're willing to assume some risk on game day and with travel if there were negative tests, even knowing that it was over a shortened and compressed time frame. So if it is proven to the NFL's and the team's satisfaction that the positive case in Tennessee had little to do with the previous outbreak over the past 10 days, excuse me, then maybe we see them play this game on Tuesday. But I don't know. I think there's going to be some sense. Again, the league has also decided pretty much last week's baseline expectation is that they don't want players traveling on game day. So there should be something we should know by relatively early on Monday morning, and you can probably expect another round of testing tonight, as they did with New England last week out in Tennessee. And if that goes well, then we'll likely hear that the game is still on. But there's been some more doubt about these games this morning that there were this time last week. Again, that's all me showing the work behind me saying I really don't know.
Yeah.
I guess given what the NFL has done so far this week, you'd say 50-50 at best. But I thought the same thing of the Kansas City New England situation for all the reasons that we saw rear their head over the past 7 days. And by pretty late on Sunday, it was they were ready to go with the game on Monday night. So it's when we get to these situations, it really is an hour-to-hour decision and discussion with when the NFL chooses to do tests and what they're going to decide to do. So you almost have to have some sort of Monday hedge on your roster if you want to go with Derrick Henry and others, because I think, again, if they're not allowing teams to travel, you will know that by Monday, and you've got a couple of games to choose from going into that point.
Yeah, there's some good hard data there that Chargers and Saints players can help you extend the timeline for your decision. And as you said, I think a really important thing to highlight that you pointed out, Gene, is that this is a changing situation, and we can't quite discern why Denver, New England's been treated one way, and Tennessee, Buffalo, at least as of this moment, is still on, is treating a different way. And it could very well be we are seeing New England players, James White, the McCourty brothers, saying that, they don't believe that the NFL has their players' best interest in mind. Oh, Gene, we could get to a whole other larger discussion of player safety, right? Like there's a real unholy intersection here between the NFL and its record of player safety and our country and how coronavirus response is being handled. And this is where we are. But if you have those New Orleans and Chargers players, it can extend out the ability to make this decision until tomorrow, at least knowing that you have someone that won't give you a zero. And I hate to say this, But until I see evidence otherwise, I'm going to assume that even if I might think it's unwise to play the game, that the NFL is going to err on the side of playing the game. They don't seem like they're in the mood to err on the side of not playing the game with that Denver New England result. But like Gene said, we don't have contact tracing information. There's information they have that we don't have that is informing their decisions. And if there's anything positive, it's so funny, Gene. Even the word positive, 2020 has ruined the word positive, right? Because it has these Freudian overtones of coronavirus. It is that when they've played these games, even if you thought it was unwise for them to play these games, the Minnesota-Tennessee game, the Kansas City-New England game, the other teams aren't having outbreaks. So there's some evidence, just, empirical evidence, just based on experiments, if you will, and this season is an experiment, that while there might be an active outbreak on a team, that doesn't necessarily mean that playing football, as strange as that may seem, counterintuitive, is going to trigger an outbreak on the other team. Go ahead.
We hope, right? So past performance does not dictate future results.
Of course.
So what I think we need to be hopeful of is that maybe there's a little bit of indication. I don't know that this is the case. There's been enough studies that suggest that asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread is possible in close contact situations. You would think that because players aren't testing positive for the most part until they're symptomatic, which makes sense in some regard, that maybe not allowing anybody that's symptomatic on the field with anything will limit your risk of close contact. But I put a little Twitter thread together this morning about the general recommendations for quarantine that we've seen from those epidemiologists and virologists that are following infectious disease most closely, COVID and otherwise. And it includes close contact. It includes touching. I mean, the CDC the site says hugging and kissing, and I would imagine that, slamming helmets together along the line and tackling would be kind of in that same run, or anything that gets respiratory droplets on you. So, there's a lot to learn. Unfortunately, we're still early enough. I know it doesn't seem like that to anyone, including myself, that we're still early enough in the understanding of what COVID can do and how COVID can be transmitted. That yes, it seems like a little bit of an experiment, and for certain, for there to have been no obvious cross-contamination between New England, Kansas City, and Tennessee and Minnesota back in week 2 is reassuring. But I don't know that that's, we continue to see folks test positive 4 or 5 days after what we presume their exposure to have been. And without knowing precisely what their level of infectivity is and contagiousness at any of those days in between, it's hard to know for certain. So it really stresses the league when some of these positive tests are returned on Friday night through Sunday morning in terms of, okay, what does that mean? Is somebody likely to become symptomatic or close to symptomatic within those 4 to 6 hours around the game time? And we know that's a high risk situation. So yes, so far so good. In the continuum of what might be a higher risk issue and exposure for COVID, maybe in-game exposures, but we hear about church choirs spreading things over a period of time. You got a quarterback barking signals in the huddle and everybody breathing heavy. I am not willing to say yet that that on-field gameplay is zero risk. I don't think anybody would say that. Obviously, it's less than you sit in a meeting room for 2 hours with somebody that's potentially contagious, unmasked within 6 feet. That's obviously a higher risk. Or being on a plane for 5 hours and then a bus back and forth to the game, hotel rooms and lobbies and what have you, probably a little bit higher risk. But again, this is all about how much virus you get exposed to, and certainly heavy breathing along the lines. Again, if we're going to consider some sort of hugging and direct contact as a need for quarantine after a known COVID positive situation, then the NFL has made decisions that some of these rules are not going to apply to them because they are testing so aggressively. But testing isn't going to be sufficient, as we've seen. Some players are going to test positive that were known close contacts when they weren't symptomatic initially. So, lots of things going on here. We've talked about this in each of the last couple of weeks. It's going to be difficult. To answer the question again, I don't think there's any way that we can feel 100% confident that in-game play and in-game exposures won't cause further cases down the line.
Yeah, and I bring this up mainly as simulating the NFL psychology here, Gene. It's like if they're looking for a reason to keep playing, I'm not saying it's a valid reason or a sound reason, but it is a reason, and they sure seem like they are looking for it. I also love, by the way, Gene, I am glad if the pandemic has given us one thing. Actually, one of my favorite pandemic moments, just as an aside, was when the golf course at Audubon Park was closed and they still had the sprinklers on, and kids were just running through the golf course. Like, here's one thing that makes more sense during the pandemic: the golf courses are. I saw kids playing in a bunker like it was a sandbox. Like, this makes sense. Hugging and kissing being as high risk as playing football. So I just like that equivalency. So that's another little gift the pandemic has given us. Is hugging and kissing is roughly the same risk as playing football, and there's a similarity there. But on a more serious note, I mean, obviously fantasy football is like way down the list of things, but winter is coming. And we know how many times going into games in a typical season that there's flu in the locker room, right? How many times there are players questionable with illnesses. I know you are all too familiar with that, not just from your work, but having to know that, 9 out of every 10 or 49 out of every 51 of these players that are illness questionable play, and then there'll be that one that doesn't. But when those illnesses start happening, and may this be one of the best cold and flu seasons we've experienced in terms of disease, just because everybody is so much more aware of being a disease vector and how to prevent it. But when players start coming in with these respiratory illness symptoms as we get deeper into the season, you have to think there's going to be a lot of players just ruled out on Wednesday, Thursday, whatever. Or do you think that the NFL is going to continue to rely on COVID testing and basically say, because did you see Ryan Tannehill's comments from yesterday?
Yep. Yeah,
So,
I put it. That was my second COVID related thread of the morning. I hope folks are not getting too disappointed with me for all of that. But yeah, so a few things. Deebo Samuel was an interesting test case for that this week, where he had some sort of fever and apparently some other symptoms. I'm not sure whether it was respiratory or stomach related or what have you. But Kyle Shanahan said, the protocol applies to when you check those things off on the symptom checklist. You're not going to be allowed to play if you had a fever that morning this year. You are not going to be allowed to play if you're actively symptomatic, because symptomatic folks, whether it's COVID or not, put the entire team at risk of spreading something around where it's unclear whether or not those symptoms, because with a few exceptions, many of the symptoms that we see with COVID, you'll see with any number of other respiratory viruses that we see this time of year. So Samuel, in some respects, maybe was lucky to have his symptoms start Tuesday into Wednesday, was able to have 48 hours of negative tests, was able to have full resolution of the fever for a good 24 to 48 hours before he could be cleared to return to the facility on Saturday. But yes, if a player shows up symptomatic on Friday night into Saturday, maybe there's not enough time for those COVID-related protocols to be done, because they're not going to want anybody symptomatic on the field. In the same way that all of us are probably a little bit more leery of someone who sneezes with an allergy or coughs to clear their throat around us right now, you can see the same thing happening in some respects on the field. So we're going to try to keep everyone as healthy as possible. And this trickles down to all of us: schools, workplaces, what have you. The fewer infections we have, the less concern we're going to have about, well, is that COVID or something else? And Tannehill's point was a reasonable one, which was it was a little bit disconcerting for him to see clearly symptomatic players test negative on a day-to-day basis while they were symptomatic. And what was left unsaid in that quote that was posted on Twitter this morning was whether or not those players later tested positive, which would be a concern if we're getting lots of false negative tests on symptomatic folks. Big concern, right? Or if it's what I'm seeing here locally and what we're going to see throughout the fall and winter, which is that there are hundreds of other viruses with different incubation periods, with different methods of transmission, but all respiratory and all similar symptoms. There are going to be folks that have non-COVID illnesses that need to be tested and hope to recover quickly with negative tests. But you're right, that's going to be something else that the NFL faces, that NBA, NHL, other professional leagues this summer, bubbled up or not, did not have to face, because we're in a relatively less likely period of time where we get those common cold rhinoviruses and any number of other things that I'll spare you all the mumbo jumbo about what those viruses are. But we run tests for 15 to 20 viruses sometimes when we need to, including flu and other things, and one of them will come positive. And we can see there are trends certain times of the year where some of those viruses are going to be more likely than others. Right now, it's just plain old rhinovirus, which is cold symptoms and maybe a little bit of stomach stuff. And by far, in lots of places, that's the most common thing that you're going to see. So it stands to reason that if other things are spreading in the community, so will those. And we can have negative COVID tests that are accurate in folks that are still symptomatic with respiratory and stomach symptoms. So one of many challenges, we were talking about this in May and June. We were trying to decide how the NFL might navigate some of the many stresses and pressures that they're going to have on them, is that they are going to be the primary sport that's playing during respiratory season, and all these issues are going to come up. So I would think that that's likely to happen. We'll see if the NFL is going to be comfortable allowing mildly symptomatic folks with multiple negative COVID tests out there under the thought that this is a non-COVID illness. We'll see. So Deebo Samuel was kind of the first test case, but more are coming for sure.
Yeah, and as always, Gene, I appreciate you digging in the best you can on these issues with a lot of gravity. And I can't help but say, on these live shows, this doesn't go out to the podcast, and I just feel like every now and then there's a moment that I say, why are we even spending time on fantasy football? But we are. And if there is a Buffalo-Tennessee game on Tuesday, Gene, what do we think about Zach Moss? What do we think about A.J. Brown?
Yeah, I think Zach Moss is likely to play. The Bills, boy, there's not a lot going on injury reporting wise with the Bills right now. Maybe if it was Josh Allen, it'd be a little bit different, but Zach Moss is relatively important to that offense. We're just not hearing much. There was a little bit of positivity middle of last week, and then he wasn't able to play. A little bit more positivity this week, and I think, if I'm remembering right, all of these COVID-related things have kind of push things out. Yes, he had a full practice, Moss did, on Saturday, and he's got a couple of days yet to continue to recover and see how he responded to that full workout, as probably as minimal as it was before the Tuesday game. So I thought there was a chance he'd play last week. The Bills chose to be cautious. I think all signs suggest that that caution was with this week's game in mind. And if they play Tuesday, I would expect him to go. Now, he really only had a game and a half, a little bit more than a game and a half before he left in week 2 to know exactly what sort of usage he's going to get. So I wouldn't be expecting 10 to 15 touches necessarily, but I think their caution has probably gotten him to a situation where he's healthy enough to assume whatever role they had planned for him in the past. John Brown's a little bit interesting too, in that he was listed as a calf, and then there was some indication that maybe there was a knee condition. My guess is that was a typo. There were some things that were shared by beat writers for both teams, Bills and I think it's the Chargers, right? Mm-hmm. Where the Chargers beat writers were sharing things that said calf, and the Bills, whatever they put together, their graphic from the official website said knee, which didn't make a ton of sense. It's a little bit disconcerting that Brown didn't have a full practice, the last practice of the week this week, like he did previously, but I would expect him to play. Who's the other one we were talking about? Was Brown the other one?
A.J. Brown.
Oh, yeah. Brown, I think Brown's full practice. The difficulty with Brown is the Titans haven't been in their facility for over a week and a half. So who knows exactly what rehab and follow-up was being done. They weren't allowed to be around each other. So you don't know if A.J. Brown was entirely on his own. It seems like some of the Titans were not. But he wasn't in the facility rehabbing, and the team didn't have a day-to-day understanding of exactly how much progress he's made. So it's a really good sign, even though they listed him limited earlier in the week when they really didn't have practice, that when they came back to the facility and they did hold their first practice together on Saturday, that he was a full participant. Whether or not that means he plays, hard to know. The team themselves said that they wanted to evaluate him all the way up until game time, which means this was really, they wanted to put him, he came in feeling good. They wanted to put him through some workouts to see how the knee responded. If it does, and he's active, I think you can probably trust that maybe a little bit of limitation as far as snap count goes and target count goes, but I don't think he's going to be nearly as limited as maybe what you would think of Julio Jones or some of the other players we've seen in the past with significant injuries, Mike Evans on Thursday night, for example. And I think he is trustworthy, but I don't think you're going to know that answer until inactives are released. So probably a situation where you just, you leave him on your bench for one more week and hope that he plays effectively, and you go from there.
Yeah, the extra added Buffalo, Tennessee, will they play or will they won't angle is certainly one that makes it easier to say, well, maybe don't play A.J. Brown. That's all Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith is the only, because Corey Davis on the COVID list, Adam Humphries on the COVID list, maybe some Anthony Ferkser, because certainly you would expect game script wise, if this game goes off, that Tennessee's going to have to score to keep up with Buffalo. And then, the video that went around with John Brown, Gene, was the one where he gimped off at the end of a play, which usually you would think, especially with him, I don't know if it was the calf, it was the same leg, but that put him in danger. But it doesn't sound like it is, which then complicates the Buffalo passing game. Go ahead. What were you going to say about Brown in the video?
I'm nodding in agreement that's where we are right now. It's hard to know specifics with either one of these teams right now to have a strong call on things. So, it's another situation where have a hedge available if you like, but if there's anything close on your roster to use instead, that's probably the way I would go. I think John Brown is more likely to play than AJ Brown, and whoever, if they play, I think they're both likely to be reasonably effective. We're just not going to have that answer until it gets closer to game time.
Yeah, the math is, so players like Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen, Derrick Henry, those are the most worthy to take the chance on, because if you have a player that has a 100% chance of getting 5 or 6 points, and even if there's only a 25% chance you're going to get Josh Allen's typical 30, well, I guess 5 or 6 doesn't work for quarterback. If you have Stephon Diggs, let's say you can pencil in for 15 to 20, and if you know you're only going to get 5 points from his replacement, then obviously roll the dice with Diggs. I say that because, Gene, as we're doing this live show, via Tom Pelissero, the note is that the Titans coach that tested positive hasn't been in the facility for 2 weeks. And we can say, well, does that matter? Does it not matter? Is it true or is it not true? I mean,
it doesn't matter in the sense that we've seen indications, or at least reports, that the Titans were getting together in other locations outside of the facility. So that is a positive. Well, again, there's your double entendre with the positive there. It's a reassuring sign that maybe there aren't any close contacts there. But I think, given what we've seen from Tennessee over the past 10 days, there's more contact tracing needs to be done.
Yeah, and look, let's get some real politic on this stuff, and then we will get back to. We have a few more games to talk about. We will do that before we go. But this is the issue of the moment. The NFL is usually very concerned about optics, right? And if players like James White and the McCourty brothers are starting to speak out, then how many more players are feeling that way but just not saying anything?
Lots.
A lot. So I'm not even talking about public optics here. I even mean optics from the players, for the players to have confidence. However, the flip side of that is, if Tom Pelissero is putting out there something that sure seems to me like pretext to play the game, hey, it's okay, this is the new positive, we should proceed as if there wasn't really a new positive from Tennessee because it was somebody who hasn't even been in the facility for 2 weeks, right?
Yep.
So on one hand, I feel like the NFL is getting out ahead of this so that it looks okay that they're playing the Tennessee-Buffalo game. On the other hand, if the NFL is correctly grasping what is going on, because it's 2020, folks, we shouldn't shut down our imagination for possibilities. I mean, the players could just... It's not impossible that at some point enough of the players say, I'm not going to play, that's not a strike. I don't know what we would call it, but the season will have to pause until the NFL does something. Remember, we were at the precipice of this before training camp started, where the players were coming out publicly and saying, show us you have a plan. Tell us what you're going to do if you want us to play. And I wonder if we're inching closer to that. And if the NFL not playing Buffalo and Tennessee, even if their contact tracing, et cetera, says it's as if we don't have a new positive, would be something to let a little pressure off here of the attention. Because, Gene, we've spent like 20 minutes now talking about coronavirus-related things, and the NFL was supposed to be a release. It was supposed to be the distraction, the thing that helped keep everybody sane, but it's increasingly becoming the thing that reminds us again what's going on. So, NFL, balls in your court. Go ahead.
There are so many things and so many angles that we could talk about this, but what I'll say is this. There are 32 teams, 50 some odd players on the active roster, expanded practice rosters, probably approaching 1,800 to 2,000 players. They are not all going to be uniform in how they would like to manage the risks of this situation. In the same way that we're seeing the Patriots players say, something doesn't add up here. Why are we playing? We're seeing the Broncos player saying, if you're concerned about player safety, we just practiced all week and now we're not going to have a bye. So there are so many different angles to how the NFL navigates this that it's difficult to say. But it seems clear that there is a very difficult choice, which they've known from the beginning, the NFL, that they're going to have to make. Either you follow through with the strictest quarantine guidelines and limit the risk of potential exposures and outbreaks down the road, or you run the risk of having games canceled, lack of competitive games, teams playing different numbers of games, and we may get to that. And it really is that simple at this point. There is community spread in America. Players and staff are going to continue to test positive. If they allow players to play as close contacts 48 hours after that close contact, there are going to be further tests down the line that come positive. Hopefully, the majority of these players, the younger age groups, have mild infections and no long-term issues with COVID. But you can be certain that among those 1,800 to 2,000 players, there are folks with concerning pre-existing conditions and co-founding factors. There are other folks around the team that have concern, and there is not going to be, and there was not, and there is not going to continue to be uniformity. And it was different when you were sort of bubbled in the training camp during a time of year where there wasn't as much spread and things were going well. But these players are going home where their kids are coming home from school, where there are other things. It's not a bubbled environment. There are going to continue to be positive tests. Travel is going to increase their risk. Going to a team facility where there are people in their own bubbles, your bubble is being expanded times 50 and beyond that with players and staff there. So there are going to be infections. And at some point, when it's staring you in the face and you read stories about Red Sox pitchers who can't run on treadmills because of myocarditis some months later, and you see players go through significant flu-like symptoms, we're not really hearing about that, but you can be certain that a number of these players and folks that have tested positive have had, maybe not severe cases where they're in the hospital, but they don't feel great when they get COVID. And they know that there are some long-term aspects to their careers as well. And each one of these guys and folks, coaches and what have you, staff members, men and women, are mindful of what this could mean for them 5 days, 5 years, 10 years down the line. So there are so many different angles to this. The NFL is in a difficult position. This is a business and their livelihood, both players and owners. And, just something that they have to choose about what the next course is. And when you said, I said, and you said, we're dealing with incomplete information, each one of these situations are being, I'm assuming that they're trying to make the best decision based on the information they have, and every situation's a little bit different. But the underlying goal right now seems to be, let's try to get 17 games in within 17, maybe 18 weeks, so that we can have as close to a legitimate season and meaningful playoffs as possible. But we're week 5. So it seems that the NFL is highly motivated to make this happen. Right now, the players are still on board, and we'll see how things progress. Hopefully, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks pushes everybody involved to mask and distance and hand wash and everything that we can do to limit the chances that we'll have positive tests in the future. Because it really seems like, I don't see any trend toward the NFL working towards using testing less as a way to limit the close contact quarantine recommendations.
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing here is the question that was asked after the opt-out deadline is, what if a player wants to opt out after the deadline? And I think we're going to find out pretty soon what the answer to that is. Okay, San Francisco, Miami. We've got 3 different situations here. You mentioned Deebo Samuel. He's expected to play. Raheem Mostert, Jimmy Garoppolo. This is an afternoon start. Mostert, Garoppolo, should we feel certain they're going to play, or they're likely to play, but check and make sure?
Yeah, Garoppolo is playing. For the last couple of weeks, he's had to prove that he'd be able to protect himself and for his ankle to feel as good after a workout as it did before. And that happened Friday into Saturday. There was no qualms about the Niners naming him the starting quarterback. And I would assume, because they were careful and cautious with him from, maybe he can play within 7 days of the injury to then missing a couple of weeks, that he is going to be capable of doing whatever he needs to do in the pocket. Probably a little bit of rust that will have to be knocked off as he readjusts to game speed. So maybe the first quarter, even the first game, isn't as good as it may have been otherwise. But I don't have any concern that Garoppolo is going to be a surprising inactive or struggle more than expected because of an aggravation. Mostert's situation is different and interesting and in a good way, and that Kyle Shanahan on Monday didn't really seem optimistic at all. In fact, he said that he didn't expect Mostert to be able to return this week. And then early week workouts went well. The recovery process seemed to have gone well, went all the way through this week practicing. And now this morning, all of the local writers in San Francisco are expecting Mostert to play. I don't think that we're going to see him take the full complement of snaps that he would have had he got in a full practice and had the team been planning on using him from the beginning of the week. However, if he feels good early, if the game script suggests it's the case and he doesn't have any stiffness or concern about the stability of that knee after the MCL sprain as the first half goes on, you could see him do a little bit more. But I think probably 60 to 70% of the snaps that you'd ordinarily see him get in a healthy situation without Tevin Coleman there. But there's enough talent there in San Francisco that I don't know that they're going to risk putting him back when they weren't convinced that he was going to be fully reconditioned earlier in the week. So I think Mostert plays a little bit more of a limited role than you would expect, with the potential for him to do a little bit more. So that's kind of how I'd use the calculus to decide whether or not you're comfortable using him on a roster today.
Gene, is Carson Wentz going to opt out and say it's because of COVID, but really it's because he has nobody to protect him or catch the ball?
Man, Philadelphia, these last few years with the injuries that they've sustained and trying to battle through those things are really difficult. How much
Baltimore next week? It's the Steelers. You know about forfeit. It may be the preemptive forfeit to help the. But next week it's Baltimore. We're going to see Alshon Jeffrey or Deshaun Jackson next week.
I think Alshon Jeffrey would have played this week had he not gotten sick. So I think the team really wanted to see him get through a healthy week of practice so that they know that they could trust him for the full game plan. And there was an indication on Thursday when he was sick that, boy, I don't know if we can trust him, and then not being able to do much on Friday pretty much sealed the deal. Deshaun Jackson seems to have gone through the reconditioning process this week. So assuming that his early being declared out early on Friday wasn't in evidence that things just didn't really go well on Thursday and Friday, and he's not as close as they suspected, I think we're likely to see him next week too. So hopefully both of those guys are fully practicing before the end of the week, and then Jalen Reagor around the corner. Hopefully Dallas Goedert comes back a little bit sooner than expected. Miles Sanders has seemed to be okay, and that will leave the offensive line as the primary issue. But at least they'll have as close to the full strength of their offensive skill position players as they can sooner than later.
Last one, as we're about to hit the end of the show here. Michael Thomas, Gene, as we set our lineups before the early games, before the late games, before the Sunday night game, and we have to make a decision about Michael Thomas, what would you suggest?
Well, you saved the toughest call of the week till last, and I think you can include Jared Cook in this as well. So briefly, I think you can make an argument in either direction here. I have been, based on the fact that Michael Thomas is seeming to have optimistic signs around him and practicing a little bit over the last week or so or more, where we heard he was looking fine, and then not play. And then hearing the tone of the beat writers in New Orleans suggesting that maybe they'd use this bye week to allow him to fully recover because he's not been back to full practice yet. So you would assume that he's not 100% yet, that they'd give him through this bye week and move on. And the Saints aren't talking at all. Sean Payton has pretty much said, I'm not telling you all anything about injuries. Don't even ask me. So they're not even getting questions asked anymore. But through Friday into Saturday, another limited practice on Saturday, the tone of the beat writers has changed. And not only that, we didn't get anything from Adam Schefter specifically, but he retreated Mike Triplett's position that it looks like Thomas is in line to play this week. And the thought being that he then has 2 weeks afterwards to deal with whatever leftover soreness is there. So I think a few things are clear. One, we really have no idea. It's still a game time decision. Two, that the 2 weeks of limited practice suggests that the Saints are going to be willing to allow him to play. Three, I don't even know where I am at this point, but I'm just going to keep stream of consciousness here. That if they do allow him to play, knowing that they've been cautious so far, it suggests that he's probably healthy enough to have relatively rare risk of re-injury, and that they are going to feed him targets to the extent that he's able. So I don't know that there's a ceiling expectation for Michael Thomas this week. Kamara is playing better. Emmanuel Sanders seems to have a little bit better rapport over with Drew Brees as things go on. Traquan Smith is there now, and they're willing to throw him the ball. So I don't know that 20 targets is possible for Michael Thomas, but I wouldn't rule out double-digit targets if he plays. And I'm leaning more towards probable than I would have 48 hours ago when it just wasn't enough there to suggest that the Saints were going to do anything different than they did the week before. So run with that how you like. I think there's a good chance he's active. If he's active, I'd have no qualms with him in a fantasy lineup. But I don't feel 100% confident saying, yes, he's going to be active in the same way that I'm pretty 100% confident that no, Julio Jones is not playing.
And there you have it. I'm positive that we still enjoy spending time together. And whether it's holding each other's hands and talking through this, or occasionally forgetting about it and being distracted by our fantasy football lineups or our football team or whatever the football topic of the moment is, that this is helpful and this is therapeutic. I know it certainly is for me, and I am always thankful to the time, again, given by Mitch Carl, DFS and Donuts. If you haven't heard about Rise or Fall and you play DFS, not just football, by the way, you need to check that out. And the time given over by Dr. Gene, and it's a chance for me to say, and I know I don't want to make Dr. Gene blush or otherwise, but I feel like it needs to be said, folks. People like Dr. Gene, including Dr. Gene, are taking responsibility for the health of our communities right now. They're making the hard calls that nobody wants to make on these things and making plans for us to make it through the winter, and putting themselves at risk in the process, putting their families at risk in the process because someone has to do it. So thank you, Gene, as always, and everyone else out there that are basically being that front line for us as we go back into, deeper into the deep end of coronavirus as the numbers are going up. And I feel like this is a message that doesn't need to be said for this audience. But really, folks, take care of yourself. Keep yourself safe. Keep your family safe. Keep your neighbors and your community safe. Masks work. Social distancing works. Sanitation, hand sanitizer, it works. And as we're going to get into the winter, it is important for anything to remain normal, for all of us to do these things and to be examples out in our communities for other people. And hopefully we can hit some sort of tipping point where these practices become much more widespread in the winter and we can do better. Certainly, folks, we love spending time with you every Sunday morning and all the other times we get to spend time with you in the Audible. We appreciate your helping support football guys and fantasy football. And we love you. So stay safe,